Holiday flights are the happiest flights in aviation. Families with their kids, friends with their cameras, people who have spent weeks looking forward to the moment they step off the airplane. The flights in this video carried all of these people. None of them reached the holiday they had paid for. These are the tourist flights that never came home. Subscribe to Terra Obscura. The Portuguese island of Madeira is the eroded remains of a volcano. Its mountains rise straight out of the Atlantic Ocean to nearly 2,000 meters, with cliffs and ravines running all the way down to the sea. There's almost no flat ground on the entire island. By the early 1960s, this had become a problem. Madeira was attracting more and more tourists every year. The island needed an airport, but there was nowhere to build one. Engineers eventually solved the problem by taking a hilly peninsula between two bays and filling the gap with earth. The runway sat on top of a mound, nearly 60 meters above the beach, with steep drop-offs on every side. When the airport opened in 1964, the runway was just 1,600 meters long. By 1972, it was clear that the runway would have to be extended. By 1977, the extension had still not been built. On the evening of the 19th of November of that year, a Boeing 727 operated by TAP Air Portugal lined up for the final approach. The flight had come from Brussels with a stop in Lisbon. There were 156 passengers and 8 crew on board. Almost all the passengers were tourists or Portuguese expatriates returning home. The captain was João Lontrão. The weather around the island was poor. Rain showers moved across the airport every few minutes. There was no instrument landing system at Madeira. The runway could only be used in visual conditions. The first approach came in from the southwest, lined up for runway 06. As the 727 descended, the visibility began to deteriorate. The pilots reached their minimum descent altitude and still could not see the lights of the runway. They were forced to abandon the approach. They tried again from the opposite direction on runway 24. At 600 feet, they lost sight of the runway again. They climbed and reported a second missed approach. The captain told the controller he could try one more time. After that, they would have to divert to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. They did not have the fuel for more attempts. The controller suggested that they wait, since the storm seemed to be passing. The captain refused. He could not sit in a holding pattern while burning the last of his diversion fuel. The third approach lined up on runway 24. The controller warned that there was a heavy downpour near the tower. The pilots could see the runway lights through the edges of the shower. They kept descending. The tower reported that the wind was now calm. The captain said he would land. The airplane crossed the threshold at a speed about 44 kilometers per hour, faster than the proper landing speed for Madeira. Captain Lontrão raised the nose to flare. With the excess speed, the runway sloping gently downhill, and the wet surface beneath them, the airplane refused to settle onto the ground. It floated. The 727 was now skimming a few meters above the runway, too fast to land and rapidly running out of distance. It finally touched down close to halfway down the 1,600-meter runway, still 19 knots faster than it should have been. The runway was covered in standing water. The drainage grooves had been allowed to wear down over the years, and the water was running lengthwise instead of off to the sides. As soon as the tires touched the surface, they were no longer touching the surface. They were riding on a film of water. The captain stamped on the brakes. The brakes had nothing to grip. The 727 flew off the western end of the runway at 145 kilometers per hour. The pavement ended at the edge of the platform above the beach. The airplane fell down the embankment, cleared the perimeter road, and slammed tail first into a stone bridge that crossed a dry ravine on the shore. The impact tore the airplane apart. The tail section snapped off and came to rest on top of the bridge. The forward fuselage and both wings broke loose and tumbled down onto the beach. Local witnesses ran to the wreckage and pulled survivors out of the breaking fuselage. By the time the airport fire trucks arrived, ordinary people had already done most of the rescue work. 131 people did not survive. Both pilots and the flight engineer were among the dead. Their bodies were never found. Of the 164 on board, 33 lived. At the time, it was the deadliest aviation accident in Portuguese history. The investigation identified the long list of factors that had ended the flight: the excessive landing speed, the contaminated runway, the drainage grooves that had been allowed to wear down, the pilot's decision to keep trying instead of diverting earlier. But what every investigator privately understood was that the airport itself was the real cause. The runway was simply too short, the drop-offs too steep, the margin too small. Portuguese authorities began an effort that would eventually extend the Madeira runway by more than 900 meters using a concrete platform built on stilts out over the bay. The project took 14 years. It opened in the year 2000. The new runway sits on hundreds of columns anchored 18 meters into the bedrock of the seabed, with the main island highway running underneath it. The 1st of December was a national holiday in Yugoslavia. In the autumn of 1981, a travel agency in the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana decided to mark the holiday by organizing a one-day excursion for tourists to the French Mediterranean island of Corsica. They would fly out in the morning, spend the day in the coastal city of Ajaccio, and fly back the same evening. The travel agency was called Compass. The airline they chartered was Inex-Adria Aviopromet, the Slovenian state carrier. Inex-Adria sent one of its 3 brand-new McDonnell Douglas MD-82s. The extra seats were filled with employees of the airline, employees of the travel agency, and their families. The final passenger count was 173, plus 7 crew, for a total of 180 people on board. The airplane was so full that small children had to be seated 2 to a seat. The airline's own mechanic was assigned the cockpit jump seat. In command of the flight was Captain Ivan Kunovic. The first officer was Frank Terglav. Neither of them had flown into Ajaccio before. Terglav had brought his young son Tomas along to see the airplane. The flight departed Ljubljana shortly after 7:45 in the morning. About halfway through, the mechanic gave up his jump seat so that the first officer's son could sit in the cockpit for the descent. Ajaccio sits on a strip of flat land on the western side of Corsica, surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. The airport had no radar. The controllers tracked incoming aircraft entirely by position reports written down on paper. The weather that morning was poor, with strong winds gusting through the mountains. As the pilots ran through their approach briefing, the boy in the jump seat kept pointing at things outside the windows and asking what they were. The briefing was interrupted several times. One of the items the pilots failed to cover was the minimum safe altitude in the holding pattern around the Ajaccio beacon. That altitude was 6,800 feet. The controller on duty that morning was 24 years old. He had received his approach controller certificate the month before. Captain Kunovic radioed in to say he was approaching the beacon and requested a further descent. The controller replied with a long transmission that included the phrase, "It will be for a procedure from the VOR." He meant to indicate that the airplane was cleared to fly the published approach. He did not use the word cleared. The word cleared is the word that pilots are trained to listen for. Captain Kunovic did not hear it. He understood that the controller wanted him to enter the holding pattern and wait. He reported overhead the beacon, said the airplane was now in the holding pattern, and asked again for a descent. The controller heard the second descent request and made an assumption. Most pilots who flew into Ajaccio knew about a common shortcut. If they reached the beacon at a low enough altitude, they could skip the holding pattern entirely. The controller assumed that this was what Flight 1308 was doing. He cleared them to descend to 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet was almost 4,000 feet below the minimum safe altitude in the holding pattern. The airplane was, in fact, still in the holding pattern. Captain Kunovic read back the clearance and began descending. The way the holding pattern was drawn on his approach chart made it look smaller than it actually was. At the speed Flight 1308 was flying, the holding pattern extended out far enough to pass over a mountain called Monte San Pietro. On the chart, the mountain did not appear to be near the pattern at all. The MD-82 flew the outbound leg of the holding pattern, then turned back. Captain Kunovic radioed in. He used the word rolling to describe the turn. The French controller was used to the word turning. He asked Kunovic to report when he was turning inbound. Neither of them specified inbound to what. Captain Kunovic replied that they were turning inbound to Ajaccio. He meant inbound to the beacon. The controller heard inbound to the airport. The two of them were now holding 2 completely different pictures of where the airplane was. The MD-82 continued to descend through the clouds, on a course that took it directly over Monte San Pietro. The ground proximity warning system began to call out. At almost the same instant, the controller radioed up to ask whether the pilots wanted to fly a left-hand or right-hand circuit for the runway. The 2 transmissions overlapped in the cockpit headsets. For several seconds, neither pilot could process what he was hearing. The warning system increased its urgency. Captain Kunovic finally shouted at the first officer to apply power. The airplane was banking through a 30-degree left turn at that moment. The left wingtip struck a saddle near the top of Monte San Pietro. The impact tore off the outer 8.5 meters of the wing. The airplane began to roll over. It continued forward for another 7 seconds before slamming into a rock outcrop on the side of a ravine 700 meters below the saddle. All 180 people on board died on impact. The wreckage was not located until almost 5 hours later. All 180 victims were Slovenian. The investigation identified the chain of misunderstandings, the missing word cleared, and the misleading approach chart. In the years that followed, the approach to Ajaccio was redesigned. The holding pattern was moved out over the sea. The approach charts were revised. The word cleared was given its final, fixed meaning. The wreckage of the MD-82 was left on Monte San Pietro for 27 years. The terrain was too difficult to reach with heavy equipment. In the summer of 2008, helicopters finally carried 27 tons of debris off the mountain. The crews also recovered additional human remains that the original 1981 search had missed. 27 years after a one-day trip to Corsica, the last of the passengers finally went home. In the south of England, in a cluster of small villages in Somerset, the women's social clubs of the early 1970s had a tradition. Each spring, the various groups in towns like Axbridge, Cheddar, and Congressbury would pool their money for a holiday abroad. Anyone who wanted to join could pay a share into the fund and come along. For the spring of 1973, the women planned a one-day shopping trip to the Swiss city of Basel. They booked a chartered airliner to carry them out and back in a single day. With every member who wanted to come, and the husbands, children, and friends who joined them, the booking filled an entire airplane. The airline they chartered was Invicta International. Invicta sent its largest aircraft, a Vickers Vanguard 4-engine turboprop that could seat 139 people. The flight number was 435. Most of the passengers were women. Many of them were mothers. The captain that morning was a 47-year-old Canadian named Anthony Dorman. Dorman had wanted to be a pilot for most of his adult life. He had also struggled at it. His earliest attempt to train with the Royal Canadian Air Force had ended when his instructors wrote that he displayed insufficient aptitude for flying. To get the British instrument rating that allowed him to fly in cloud and at night, he had failed 8 examinations and passed the 9th. The senior captain in the right seat was a more competent pilot named Terry. Because Terry had flown the empty positioning leg that morning, it was Dorman's turn to fly the leg to Basel. The Vanguard lifted off from Bristol just after 7. Basel was already covered in heavy snow with visibility down to 700 meters. The airport sat just inside French territory, with the Jura Mountains rising a few kilometers to the south. To land at Basel through clouds and snow, the pilots needed to follow a series of radio beacons. The beacons in this part of Europe emitted an unmodulated signal, which meant the pilots could not hear an audible identifier when they tuned them in. The only way to be sure that the airplane was tracking the correct beacon was to cross-check the frequency, the heading, and the displayed bearing all at the same time. The instruments in this particular Vanguard had problems. The captain's direction finder had a poor electrical connection. His course deviation indicator had been reported by another crew the previous day as showing the airplane on course when it was significantly off. The first officer's glide slope receiver had a calibration error that caused it to display a centered needle even when it was receiving no signal at all. The airline had not addressed any of these problems. As Flight 435 approached Basel, the pilots began to confuse one beacon with another. The beacon north of the airport, on the approach path, was called BN. The beacon south of the airport, on the wrong side, was called BS. As the airplane wandered in the snow, Captain Dorman started tracking BS when he thought he was tracking BN. Every position report placed him in a different part of the sky from where he actually was. The airplane flew straight over the city of Basel at low altitude. On the ground, a retired Swiss air pilot named Beck saw the Vanguard pass overhead. He called the airport tower and told the controller that an airliner had just passed over his observatory at 50 meters, headed south, and that if it stayed at that altitude, it would crash into the mountains. The controller listened, agreed, and ended the call. No one ever passed the message on to the pilots. Captain Terry took over the controls from Captain Dorman. He was a better pilot. He was no less confused about where they were. After a second loop that ended in the wrong place, the airplane intercepted the back beam of the runway's instrument landing system. A localizer signal extends out in 2 directions from the airport, with the strong beam pointing toward incoming aircraft and a weaker beam pointing the other way. Pilots are not supposed to use the back beam. Captain Terry, with his faulty glide slope indicator showing a centered needle, believed he was on the real localizer. He followed the back beam south, into the mountains. A controller at the Zurich Regional Center spotted them on his radar screen and called the Basel Tower. The Basel controller picked up the microphone and asked Flight 435 if they were sure they were over the right beacon. Captain Dorman said he thought he had a spurious indication. He said the direction finders were all over the place in this weather. The controller said he did not see them on his radar. He said he thought they were south of the field. A second later, Captain Terry initiated a go-around. By then, the mountainside in front of him was higher than the airplane could climb in the time it had left. The Vanguard clipped the trees at the top of a ridge. It rolled inverted. It came down upside down in a snowy field, breaking into pieces as it slid through the forest. The front of the airplane was destroyed instantly. The tail section, which had broken off as the airplane cartwheeled, came to rest on its roof some distance further on, with 37 people inside it, still alive. They unbuckled their seatbelts and fell onto what had been the ceiling. They climbed out into knee-deep snow. Two men, one of them with a broken leg, set out to find help. The remaining survivors, mostly women, huddled together around the broken tail and sang hymns to stay warm. The first person to reach them was a 10-year-old farm boy out for a walk who stumbled across the wreckage. He led them back to his family's house, where they waited for the ambulances. 108 people did not survive. 89 of them were women. Most of those women were mothers. The crash left 55 children in Somerset without their mothers. One woman who had stayed home that day lost 11 members of her family. The investigation found multiple faulty instruments, confused beacon identifications, and a captain who should never have been holding an instrument rating in the first place. Invicta International had no record of having attempted any repairs to the faulty equipment. For the small villages of Somerset, the loss was a thing that could not be measured. The island of St. Thomas in the United States Virgin Islands has been a Caribbean tourist destination since the end of the Second World War. The single airport that serves the island sits on a narrow strip of flat ground between Brewers Bay and a wall of steep forested hills. In 1976, the runway at that airport was just 1,420 meters long. For a Boeing 727, that was barely enough. Pilots and aviation experts had been warning for years that the runway needed to be extended. Local politicians had spent those same years arguing over what should be done. Nothing had been built. On the afternoon of the 27th of April, an American Airlines Boeing 727 was lined up on final approach, completing a flight that had begun that morning in Rhode Island. The flight number was American Airlines 625. There were 81 passengers and 7 crew on board. Most of the passengers were tourists heading down to the Caribbean for a holiday. The captain was Arthur Bonowski, 54 years old, a former United States Navy pilot with 22,000 flight hours and 154 previous landings at this exact airport. The weather at Charlotte Amalie was almost benign, a few clouds, a southeast wind of about 10 knots. Captain Bonowski configured the airplane for landing. The American Airlines bulletin for St. Thomas required that the captain extend the flaps to 40 degrees because the higher setting allowed the airplane to fly at a lower speed and stop in a shorter distance. The captain could choose 30 degrees only if the wind was strong or gusty. The wind that afternoon was neither. Captain Bonowski chose 30 degrees anyway. He also chose an approach speed 10 knots higher than the standard. The airplane crossed the threshold of runway 09 at 80 feet above the ground, still in position to land within the touchdown zone. Captain Bonowski began to flare. Just as the wheels were about to touch the runway, a sudden gust of wind hit the airplane from the front left. The 727 rolled hard to the right. Captain Bonowski reacted instantly, turning the yoke to the left to keep the right wing from striking the pavement. He saved the airplane from the gust, but he was now 10 feet above the runway, and the airplane was no longer settling. It was floating. The wings, with too much speed and too much lift, refused to let the airplane touch the ground. The 727 skimmed forward at 10 feet above the surface, eating up the runway. 4 seconds went by before the first officer told him they were still high. By the time Captain Bonowski pushed the airplane down onto the runway, they had used up more than half of the available pavement. He had something like 700 meters of runway and overrun left, and the airplane was still rolling at landing speed. He made a snap judgment. He decided he could not stop in time. He called for a go-around. The decision was wrong. The math worked the other way. If Captain Bonowski had committed to stopping at the moment of touchdown, the airplane could have come to a halt within the remaining runway, but the calculation for a go-around was different. To get the 727 back into the air from his current position required between 580 and 720 meters of additional runway. He did not have that distance. The pilots had never been trained for the math of a go-around after touchdown. The information was not in the operating manual. The decision probably looked, in the moment, like a normal takeoff from St. Thomas, something the captain had done many times before. He pushed the throttles forward. 5 seconds passed. He did not feel acceleration. He did not hear the engines respond. He concluded that something was wrong with the airplane, although there was nothing wrong with the airplane. He simply had not waited long enough for the engines to spin up. Realizing he was running out of time, Captain Bonowski yanked the throttles back to idle and stamped on the brakes. By then, the airplane was less than a third of the runway from the end. He had also failed to push the nose wheel back to the ground, failed to deploy the spoilers, and failed to use the thrust reversers. The airplane was now skidding with most of its braking equipment unused, in the grip of the panic response that floods a pilot's brain in the seconds before a crash. The 727 hurtled off the end of the runway at about 80 knots. It plowed through a chain-link fence, hit an earthen embankment, and skidded sideways onto the main road that ran along the perimeter of the airport. fire broke out behind the airplane. The 727 crushed a row of parked cars and brought down a set of power lines. The wreckage came to a stop against the side of a Shell gas station. The fuselage broke into 3 pieces. Most of the passengers survived the impact itself, but the fire that followed gave them perhaps 60 to 90 seconds to get out. After that, the cabin was no longer survivable. By the time the first fire truck arrived, 2 minutes after the crash, anyone who was going to survive had already left. 35 passengers and 2 flight attendants did not. The investigation found that no individual element had caused the crash on its own. The wind had not been unusual. The pilots had not been negligent. What had killed 37 people was a chain of small decisions and a runway that was simply too short to absorb them. The runway was the part that could be fixed. 4 years after the crash, an expansion project broke ground. By 1984, the runway had been extended to over 2,000 meters. There has not been another major runway overrun at St. Thomas since. In a hangar at an old Swiss Air Force base near Zurich, a small association of aviation enthusiasts kept 3 antique propeller airplanes flying long after the rest of the world had retired them. The airplanes were Junkers Ju-52s, the same boxy 3-engine transports that the Luftwaffe had used in the Second World War to move troops and supplies across occupied Europe. The 3 at Dubendorf had been built in 1939 and had served with the Swiss Air Force until the mid-1980s. The association sold tickets. Every weekend in the summer, paying customers from across Switzerland could climb on board one of the surviving Ju-52s and fly across the Alps in an aircraft built before the war. The brand on the side of the airplanes was Ju Air. In 2018, Ju Air began advertising a special 2-day excursion to the Italian-speaking Ticino region of southern Switzerland. The package included the flight down, a guided tour of Locarno, an overnight stay in a hotel, and the return flight. The price was around $1,100 per passenger. 17 people signed up. The flight on the 3rd of August went without incident. The 2 pilots were both former Swiss Air Force veterans, 62 and 63 years old, with over 20,000 flight hours each between them, almost all of them on military aircraft. They had volunteered to fill in when the originally scheduled pilots had withdrawn a week earlier. On the 4th of August, the pilots returned to Locarno and met the passengers at the airport for the flight home. The plan was a scenic route across the Central Alps back to Dubendorf. About 45 minutes into the flight, the Ju-52 was approaching the last major mountain ridge before the lowlands to the north. The pilots were flying at about 9,000 feet, heading toward a narrow gap called the Segnes Pass. On the right was a 10,000-foot mountain called the Pit Segnes. On the left was a slightly lower ridge called the Chingelhörner, which had a famous natural window through one of its descending shoulders, a tourist landmark called the Martinsloch. The pilot steered the airplane down the center of the valley so that the passengers could see the Martinsloch through the right side windows. To give them a better view, they slowed down to about 100 knots, threading the gap between the 2 mountains at a height of barely 200 meters above the rocky ground. This was every kind of dangerous flying that any pilot is taught to avoid. The center of a mountain valley leaves no escape route. The low altitude leaves no margin if an engine fails. The low airspeed leaves almost no margin above the stall, particularly with the updrafts and downdrafts that are common in alpine terrain. As the Ju-52 entered the upper part of the valley, it flew through a downdraft. The pilots reacted by pulling the nose up to maintain altitude. Then the downdraft suddenly gave way to an updraft. With the nose still pitched up, the updraft pushed the angle of attack of the wings past their critical point. The left wing began to stall. The airplane started to roll to the left, more steeply than the pilots had intended. The pilot at the controls made the correct recovery input, but he had no room to execute it. The mountain pass was below him. The Chingelhörner was to his left. The Pit Segnes was to his right. The Ju-52 rolled past 180 degrees to the left and dropped into a near vertical dive. A hiker on the pass had time to pull out a phone and record the last 0.6 of a second of the flight. The airplane slammed nose first into a rocky basin just below the pass. All 20 people on board died instantly. The investigation that followed was conducted without flight recorders, because the Ju-52 had been exempt from the rules requiring them. What the Swiss investigators had instead was photographs and video. Of the 44 mobile phones and cameras recovered from the wreckage, 10 still contained extractable data, including 23 videos taken from inside the cabin. One of them had been recording from a passenger's GoPro right up until the moment of impact. The investigators reconstructed the entire approach to the pass from the recordings alone. What they found in the days that followed went much further than the flight itself. The investigators pulled radar data on 216 GU air flights from earlier in the season. More than a third of them had been flown in ways that independent specialists judged to be high risk. Some had crossed alpine passes at a clearance of 5 meters above the ground. Some had cleared cliff faces by less than 30 meters of lateral separation. Both pilots of this flight had been among the worst offenders. The deeper investigation found that the entire operation had been allowed to drift outside the rules for years. The Swiss Civil Aviation Authority had not inspected the airline rigorously. When inspectors had ridden along on flights, they had not flown anywhere near the mountains. When complaints had come in about low altitude, flying near villages and wildlife refuges, the authority had asked Jew Air to stop and then taken no further action. The empty weight and center of gravity figures in the operations manual had been wrong for years. The pilots had been miscalculating loading on every flight without knowing it. Most of the pilots, like the two on this flight, had come to Jew Air from the Swiss Air Force, where the tolerance for low-altitude flying had been much higher. They had brought that tolerance with them. In the months that followed the crash, the Federal Office of Civil Aviation revoked the airworthiness certificates of the 2 remaining Ju 52s. The following spring, the authority revoked the company's operating certificate entirely. At the same time, it banned commercial flights using vintage aircraft anywhere in Switzerland. The Iron Annies, as the Swiss called them, did not fly with passengers in Switzerland again. A pair of stone cairns now stand on the rocky basin below the Segnius Pass, marking the place where 20 tourists came down from the sky on a clear summer afternoon, on the last sightseeing flight of an aircraft type that had once carried armies across Europe. Costa Brava, the rocky northeastern stretch of Spanish coastline, is a holiday region built almost entirely around British tourists. Every year, charter airlines fly hundreds of thousands of them in from regional airports across the United Kingdom, dropping them at the small airport outside the Catalan city of Girona. On the night of the 14th of September, 1999, one of those charter airplanes was carrying 236 tourists from Cardiff, Wales, to Girona. They were all on the same Thomson Travel holiday package. The aircraft was a Boeing 757 operated by Britannia Airways. The flight number was Britannia 226A. The captain was Brendan Nolan, 57 years old, with 16,700 flight hours. The first officer was 33. The two of them had spent the previous several days flying late-night charter rotations and were on the third shift in a row. The weather over northeastern Spain was poor. Thunderstorms covered the region. Heavy rain was falling at Girona. The first approach to runway 02 had to be abandoned when the wind reversed direction and gave the airplane a tailwind above the legal limit. The captain calculated that he had fuel for exactly one more attempt. He brought the airplane around for the instrument landing system on the opposite end of the runway. Halfway through the descent, an amber caution message appeared on the cockpit display. It told the pilots that if they diverted to Barcelona from this point, they would land with less than the company minimum fuel. At 46 minutes past 11, the lights of the runway came into view through the rain. Captain Nolan called them in sight. Heavy rain hammered the windscreen. Lightning flickered in the distance. At 250 feet above the ground, the captain switched off the autopilot to fly the airplane manually. He did it at an awkward moment. The auto throttle had been making a small thrust correction, which left the engines running with about 25% more power than they needed. The airplane began drifting above the proper glide path. He pushed the nose down to correct it. At that moment, every light at the airport went out. A storm cell had taken out the electrical supply to the entire airport. The runway lights, the approach lights, all of them disappeared at the same instant. Captain Nolan looked up from his instruments and saw nothing where the runway had been a few seconds earlier. He had less than 7 seconds before touchdown. He froze. He could not see the runway. He did not know if he was on the center line. He did not know how high above the ground he was. The ground proximity warning began calling out his sink rate. He could not flare. He could not correct the descent rate. He simply held the airplane in the attitude it was in. Then Britannia 226A slammed into the runway. The nose gear hit the pavement first, at 3 times the force it had been designed to withstand. The airplane bounced back into the air, then came down again 2 seconds later, this time even harder. The second impact tore the nose gear out of its mountings. The mechanism plowed backward through the floor and into the main electronics compartment underneath the cockpit. In that single instant, the airplane lost almost everything that helps an airliner slow down. The electrical system went dead. The anti-skid system stopped. The auto brakes stopped. The spoilers stopped. The thrust reversers stopped. There was worse to come. As the wreckage rotated through the cabin floor, it severed 2 of the 4 cables that ran from the cockpit to the engines. The 2 it cut were the ones that commanded the engines to reduce thrust. With the airplane skidding down the runway on a collapsed nose gear, both engines began to accelerate to high power on their own. The crippled 757 ran for more than a kilometer down the runway, under increasing thrust, before veering off into the grass on the right. It rumbled over an access road, slammed into an earthen mound, briefly became airborne, knocked down the airport perimeter fence, and came down in a muddy field, where it broke into 3 pieces. Captain Nolan was knocked unconscious when his head struck the window pillar. In the cabin, dozens of seats had torn loose from the floor, and yet almost no one was seriously hurt. The cabin crew began an orderly evacuation. Captain Nolan came to and was able to walk out. 244 people climbed down into the muddy field. Some of them lost their shoes in the mud and could not move. There was no sign of the emergency services. The crash alarm in the control tower had not worked when the controller pressed it. She picked up the phone and called the fire station, telling them only that she had lost contact with the airplane. The firefighters drove to the wrong end of the runway. The wreckage was hidden behind a row of trees. 18 minutes passed before a passenger who had walked back across the runway found the airport's safety officer and told him where the airplane was. In the days that followed, 243 passengers and crew returned home to Britain. One did not. An 84-year-old man who had walked away from the wreckage with apparent minor injuries died 5 days later from internal bleeding that had not been detected at the scene. He was the last passenger to die in the crash of a British scheduled or charter airliner. The single most important factor in the accident was a power outage that lasted 11 seconds, beginning 7 seconds before the 757 was supposed to touch down. The lights came back on 4 seconds after the crash. By then, it no longer mattered. The airplanes in this video were carrying people on the best days of the year. The skiers in the Gulf Stream were headed for a dinner party in Aspen. The British charter to Tenerife was full of families on their first holiday abroad. The women on the Vanguard were on their annual shopping trip to Switzerland, organized by a women's guild in a cluster of small villages in Somerset. The 727 over Madeira was carrying tourists to one of the most beautiful islands in the Atlantic. The 727 into St. Thomas was full of people on their way to a Caribbean beach. The 757 into Girona was a Thompson travel package to the Costa Brava. The Twin Otter over the Grand Canyon was a sightseeing flight. The Ju-52 over the Alps was a vintage scenic tour. The MD-82 into Ajaccio was a single-day excursion for a national holiday. None of these were business flights. None of them were commuter routes. The passengers had paid for them because they wanted to see something. They had been looking forward to the trip for weeks or months. Many of them had saved up for it. Some of them had brought their children. What links these accidents to one another is not the type of aircraft, the country of origin, or the era they happened in. What links them is the pressure that comes with a holiday flight, in a way that is almost invisible until it becomes lethal. A holiday charter has to land. The hotel rooms have been paid for. The tour group is waiting on the other side. The pilot is on the 3rd night of a rotation and would rather be home than diverting to Barcelona. The dinner reservation in Aspen is in 2 hours. The Madeira runway is too short and the weather is bad, but the alternative is putting 164 people in a hotel in the Canary Islands and rebooking them all in the morning. The runway at St. Thomas is shorter than it should be, but it has been shorter than it should be for 10 years, and nobody has ever crashed there. The Ju-52 flies low, because that is what the passengers paid to see. The Twin Otter flies below its recommended altitude, because lower is a better view. The pressure to deliver the holiday is the pressure to take the small risk, again and again, that something will not go wrong this time. Most of the time, nothing does. Aviation is statistically the safest form of long-distance travel ever invented by human beings. The pilots fly the route hundreds of times and land successfully every single time. The runway is short, but it works. The fog comes in, but the pilots have flown into it before. The crashes in this video are the times when nothing held. The lessons that came out of them are now built into the routines of the industry. Standardized phrasing between pilots and controllers. Ground proximity warning systems with terrain databases. Procedures for landing at airports surrounded by mountains. Rules about how much fuel an airliner must carry beyond its destination. Limits on duty time. Procedures for go-around after touchdown. Better lighting at small airports. Better runway drainage. Better radar in places that used to have none. Every one of those rules was paid for in lives. Most of them were paid for in the lives of people who had paid to be carried somewhere they were looking forward to. The next time you board a flight to a holiday destination, somewhere across a sea or in a mountain range, the procedures that carry you safely to the gate were written, almost without exception, after somebody did not arrive. If this story moved you, subscribe to Terra Obscura.